The English and French colonies in North America had failed to wipe the other off the map in King William's War. However, the next opportunity to do so was not far away. When the King of Spain passed away in 1700, Europe and North America once again became battlegrounds, providing the English and the French a second chance to grow their respective colonial empires at the expense of the other. Part 1. 4 Years of Peace. King Louis XIV failed to achieve his goals in Europe during the 9 Years' War, and neither England nor France could dominate North America in the adjacent King William's War. However, Louis still wanted to expand his empire. Canada and New France were ideal for this, but Louis didn't see their potential. He missed out on skilled settlers by expelling the Huguenots, French Protestants, and not allowing them to settle in Canada. Louis restricted new settlements inland and needed convincing by others to approve plans for North America. Two key figures who persuaded him were Iberville and Cadillac. After King William's War, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville returned to France and quickly gained Louis' permission to start a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River. In October 1698, he set out with sailors in tow. They passed by Pensacola Bay, where the Spanish were building Fort San Carlos. Iberville found the Mississippi River, but chose Biloxi Bay for the colony, about 100 miles west of Pensacola. He then explored the area, made alliances with local indigenous tribes, and moved the colony to Mobile Bay in 1702, where they built Fort Louis. The French colonies along the Gulf of Mexico arrived to a proxy war in America's southeast. One of the main indigenous groups in the region is the Muskogee Creek. The Creek began trading with the English colony of Carolina in the 1680s, who supplied them with guns in exchange for deerskins and slaves. At the same time, tensions with the Spanish-allied Appalachia of Florida led to open conflict in 1701. The Creek, now armed with English muskets, raided Appalachian towns. The French also became involved. They armed the Choctaw, enemies of the Creek, leading to more conflict. Should the three colonial powers become directly involved, war would be especially bloody. Antoine de la Motte Cadillac, on the other hand, had lived in Port Royal and Maine. With the help of his friend, Governor Frontenac, he was given command of Fort de Baude in 1694, on the shores of Lakes Michigan and Huron. Both believed that expanding inland was crucial for the French Empire. After Louis ordered the western posts in Canada to be abandoned, Cadillac returned to France and convinced the king's ministers that a settlement on the Detroit River was needed to protect the fur trade from the English and the Iroquois. He got permission to establish Fort Detroit and invited local tribes to settle nearby. Cadillac governed the area and gained a monopoly on the fur trade in the process. A series of deaths in Europe shifted the balance of power. When the inbred and sickly Habsburg King of Spain, Charles II, died in 1700 without an heir, two claimants for the Spanish thrones and its valuable and expensive colonies emerged. Austria supported Charles, a Habsburg, while Louis wanted his grandson, Philip, on the throne. Charles II changed his will at the last minute in favor of Philip, with the condition that France and Spain would never unite into a single country. England and the Dutch feared France's growing power and supported Austria. France found allies in Bavaria and Savoy in Italy. Spain, though divided in loyalty, joined France. When the exiled King James II of England died in France, Louis broke the Treaty of Ryswick by recognizing James' Catholic son as England's rightful king. This angered King William III of England, who died in March 1702 and was succeeded by Anne, James's Protestant daughter. Anne allied with the Dutch and Austria, declaring war on May 4, 1702, beginning the War of the Spanish Succession. After just 4 years of peace, both Europe and her colonies were at war once again. Part 2. King William's War Relived. News of the war in Europe reached the shores of North America in the summer of 1702. When the English governor of the Leeward Islands heard about the declaration of war, he quickly seized the French half of St. Christopher Island, now St. Kitts, in July. The next spring, he tried to take Guadeloupe, but failed, losing many men to battle and disease. In October 1702, Governor James Moore of Carolina gathered 500 soldiers and 300 native allies, mostly Yamassees, and sailed south to capture Fort San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida. They wanted to seize it before the French could send help. They took over several small outposts and looted the empty town, burning many homes. But the stone fort was too tough for them. Moore called for cannons, but they never came. After 7 weeks, Moore retreated when Spanish warships showed up on Christmas Day. In 1704, after losing his job as governor, Colonel Moore planned another attack. This time, he targeted the Appalachian settlements west of St. Augustine. Moore managed to gather only 50 soldiers, but got about 1,000 Creek allies. After a long march, they won a fierce battle at Aubel, destroyed 13 missions, and captured nearly 1,000 Appalachian converts as slaves. Hundreds were slaughtered, and another 13,000 were moved to the Savannah River as a buffer zone. After a few more Creek raids in the summer, the Appalachian homeland was virtually abandoned. In the English colonies, there were some political changes. The governor of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire died in 1700. Queen Anne sent her cousin, Lord Cornbury, to govern New York, but he was corrupt and ineffective. Massachusetts and New Hampshire were combined under Joseph Dudley, a Harvard graduate who had spent a lot of time in England. In New France, Governor Callière died and was replaced by the skilled Marquis de Valget. Governor Dudley met with the pro-French Abenaki of Maine in June 1703, and they promised peace. However, within a month, Governor Valget gathered 500 Abenaki and sent them to attack English towns in Maine. These warriors descended on the towns of Wells, Saco, and Casco Bay all on August 10th, with hundreds of English settlers killed or captured. Winter brought some quiet, but the worst was yet to come: the attack on Deerfield, Massachusetts. On the night of February 29, 1704, a group of Canadiens, Abenakis, and Christianized natives attacked the town. While some people found safety in stone houses, 38 were killed and 17 houses were burned. The attackers took 111 prisoners, and 18 of them died on the long march to Montreal. Massachusetts gathered 550 men under Colonel Benjamin Church. Instead of rescuing the Deerfield prisoners, they planned to attack the Abenakis from Penobscot to Port Royal in Acadia, now Nova Scotia. They left Boston on May 21st. The group burned Grand Pre in the Bay of Fundy and reached Port Royal. However, on July 14th, they decided Port Royal was too strong to attack. The force returned home with 100 prisoners. Massachusetts was frustrated that New York had done nothing to help and even seemed immune from attacks. To make matters worse, Albany merchants were secretly trading with the indigenous peoples along the St. Lawrence River. Goods taken in raids on Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts found their way into Albany shops. In the summer of 1706, war broke out again in the south. Iberville left Mobile and went to the West Indies, where he captured the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis in April. But before he could continue, he died from a fever. Spain and France wanted revenge on the English for their previous attacks on St. Augustine and the Appalachie. They hired 5 French privateers to bring Spanish troops from Havana and St. Augustine to attack Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, expecting this attack, called in his militia and strengthened its defenses. However, these might not have been needed because the Spanish attack was poorly led, and their landing parties were pushed back. 230 of them were captured. Feeling confident, the Carolinians decided to strike back at the Spanish and French. They gathered several hundred Tallapooza Creek warriors from Alabama to attack Pensacola in the summer of 1707. The attackers killed 11 Spaniards and captured 15, but couldn't take Fort San Carlos, and another attempt in November failed as well. Meanwhile, Governor Dudley asked England to help capture Port Royal, but they refused. England insisted that the colonists could and should fight their own battles. Finally, in 1707, Dudley got permission to attack. He gathered 2 regiments, seized local ships, and called on nearby colonies to join. The expedition set sail on May 13th. 1,000 soldiers landed at Port Royal, easily pushing the French back into their fort. But soon, the New Englanders started arguing among themselves. The officers didn't know how to lead a siege, and the soldiers lost trust in them. After 3 war councils, they decided to retreat to Casco Bay. Dudley demanded that they try again as soon as possible. They returned to Port Royal in August, only to find that the French had been reinforced. After a week of skirmishing with no clear winner, the New Englanders retreated again. People in Boston were furious and called for court-martials, but with officers blaming each other, there was hardly enough left to serve as judges. The embarrassing arguments eventually faded away. In 1708, border raids resumed. In midsummer, Governor Vaudreuil organized a force of 100 Canadiens and 300 indigenous warriors under Hertel de Rouville, who had previously led the attack on Deerfield. Along the way, many indigenous warriors turned back, believing they saw bad omens. With his force nearly halved, de Rouville decided to attack Haverhill, Massachusetts. Just before dawn on August 29th, the French and indigenous forces attacked. The villagers fought back fiercely. The raiders tried to burn down houses but failed. The fighting lasted several hours before the attackers retreated, their tails tucked between their legs. Part 3. Half Measures. In 1706, Samuel Vetch, a 38-year-old Scotsman, traveled to England. Although he was new to Massachusetts trade, he knew that defeating Canada needed British military support. Determined, he pushed this idea to key government officials. Governor Dudley and Lord Lovelace, the incoming governor of New York, backed the plan. By late 1708, the Board of Trade, which handled Britain's colonial matters, agreed. Queen Anne approved it in February 1709. Vetch was rewarded with a colonel's commission to oversee colonial preparations and was promised the governorship of Canada after its conquest. Vetch and Colonel Francis Nicholson then sailed to Boston. 1,500 men from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania were to gather in Albany in May to march on Montreal. The Iroquois were also to be involved, but since they had been at peace with New France since 1701, this seemed unlikely. New England was to raise 1,000 men to join the British in attacking Quebec and Port Royal by sea. Despite Governor Lovelace's sudden death, New York, under Lieutenant Governor Richard Ingoldsby, quickly abandoned its neutral stance. Colonel Nicholson was chosen to lead the forces at Albany. For the first time, the northern colonies worked together, believing that driving out the French was the only way to secure lasting peace. Everything was ready, and excitement was high, but the British fleet and troops never arrived. June, July, and August passed without any word from Britain. Trade stopped, and the gathered troops needed something to do. Colonel Nicholson built a wagon road north of Albany, constructed 2 forts, and led his troops to the head of Lake Champlain to keep them occupied. Finally, in September, they were ordered to disband. In October, a disappointed Vetch received a brief message from London that the expedition had simply been, quote, laid aside. Frustrated, representatives from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, along with military officers, met in Rehoboth, Rhode Island, at Vetch's urging. Despite their anger, the delegates drafted a petition to the Queen, asking for the expedition to be rescheduled for the next year. Colonel Nicholson sailed to England with the petition. In London, Nicholson was given command of colonial forces and 500 British Marines to attack Port Royal, but not Quebec. Nicholson returned to Boston in July 1710, and preparations began. The expedition sailed in September. The small French garrison at Port Royal surrendered on October 2nd. Port Royal was renamed Annapolis Royal, and Vetch became the governor of the area. However, Vaudreuil was not willing to accept the loss of Acadia. He encouraged the locals to resist and urged missionary priests to keep the indigenous people hostile toward the English. Nicholson returned to England again to push for the conquest of Canada, now facing a new anti-war Tory government. Vetch and other colonial governors supported his argument. A Canadian conquest appealed to the Tories as a way to gain prestige similar to the pro-war Whigs, who had benefited from the Duke of Marlborough's victories in Europe. The Tories even agreed to cover the cost of sending regular troops to America. Preparations in 1711 were kept secret but started slowly. Admiral Sir Hovenden Walker arrived in Boston before the end of June, with more than 60 ships and an army of 5,000 under General John Hill. However, the mood was gloomy, with memories of the failed 1709 expedition still fresh. Despite this, the impressive fleet sailed north on July 30th. But, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, bad weather and poor navigation caused 8 ships to crash on the rocks, sinking them. Over 700 British soldiers, 35 women, and likely 200 sailors died in the fog. After more delays, the British ships sailed back to England, and the New England vessels returned to Boston. Left stranded at Lake Champlain, Nicholson was furious when he heard the news. Quebec celebrated, thanking God for saving the city from what would have been the second siege by the English. A later meeting of the governors revealed that the colonies were too financially drained to attempt a third invasion of Canada. The mood in England was similar, where the Tories dismissed Marlborough from command in December 1711 and began peace talks in Utrecht in the Dutch Republic. A truce was signed in August 1712. The Peace of Utrecht, signed on April 11, 1713, ended the War of the Spanish Succession in Europe and Queen Anne's War in North America. Britain gained Hudson Bay, Acadia, Newfoundland, and St. Kitts and Nevis. Spain lost Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain. Britain also got the profitable Hacienda de Negros, a contract to sell African slaves to Spanish colonies for 30 years. Britain recognized Philip as the King of Spain, and France agreed not to interfere with Protestant rule in Britain. Louis XIV gave up the French throne for his great-grandson, Louis XV, keeping Spain and France separate. Louis died in 1715 at 76. The Treaty of Utrecht helped Britain gain power in the Americas and made Canada safer for the American colonies. British soldiers at Annapolis Royal reduced indigenous raids in Maine. New England fishermen could fish safely in Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay fur trade continued smoothly. The Iroquois were considered British subjects, although they didn't agree. France, however, kept Cape Breton Island off the coast of Nova Scotia and started building a new fort, Louisbourg. In the south, indigenous trouble continued. The Tuscaroras attacked northern Carolina in 1711, killing 130 people. After a brief peace, fighting resumed. In 1713, Colonel James Moore Jr. led a militia and native allies, killing 800 Tuscarora warriors. Defeated, the Tuscaroras moved to New York to join their Iroquois brethren, the Oneidas, but were never fully treated equally. Just as the Carolinians recovered, the Yamasees rebelled in 1715, killing many traders and planters. They were eventually defeated, and the survivors fled to Florida. The Lower Creeks turned to the French for safety, and as indigenous groups aligned with the Spanish and French, the Carolinians pushed inland. The most important legacy of Queen Anne's War was the idea that the English colonies might not need support from their mother country after all. The English colonies, for the first time, experienced complete cooperation with each other, boosting their self-confidence. When they asked for support from Britain, what little of it they received, if at all, was lackluster and unfulfilling. Feelings of disgust and distrust grew with Britain. As one French officer of the time put it, "There is an antipathy between the English of Europe and those of America, who will not endure troops from England even to guard their forts. If the French colonies should fall, Old England will not imagine that these various provinces will then unite, shake off the yoke of the English monarchy, and erect themselves into a democracy."